In the dusty summer of 1884, in the heart of the Colorado Territory, where legacy meant everything and love was considered a luxury, Garrett Calloway found himself staring down a future he hadn't chosen. Raised under the rigid expectations of his father, Silas Calloway Garrett had always known his destiny would be more obligation than aspiration. The Calloway name carried weight: 15,000 head of cattle, 60 hired men, and enough land to cast shadows over the neighboring ridges. But all that land came with a price, and Garrett was about to pay it, not with money, but with a vow. When Silas handed Garrett a sealed envelope, it wasn't a request. It was a decree. Garrett was to marry Evelyn McCrae, a quiet woman from a family that had once owned fertile land, but had long since faded from the town's esteem. Evelyn was the last of her name clinging to a patch of soil that hadn't yet been swallowed by debt or drought. To Silas, she was a key to expansion, a chess piece to secure legacy. To Garrett, she was a stranger and a symbol of everything he'd never wanted. The order was simple: marry her and strengthen the Calloway hold over Hollow Creek. There was no talk of compatibility, no curiosity about her heart, no question of choice. You don't marry for flutters and fireworks, Silas had said. You marry for land. It was the same path Silas had walked, loveless and firm, and now he expected Garrett to do the same. Garrett's reaction wasn't rebellion, it was resignation. He had spent a lifetime learning how to carry the weight of a name that didn't leave room for dreaming. As he stood in his father's study, surrounded by the scent of cigar smoke and ambition, he didn't argue. But something inside him shifted a seed of doubt that legacy built on command rather than connection might not be a legacy worth carrying. That seed would matter more than either man knew. Because sometimes what starts as a transaction can open the door to something deeper. If the people inside that bargain are brave enough to ask, is duty the same as destiny? The Calloway wedding wasn't a celebration. It was a formality draped in dust and silence rather than flowers and laughter. There were no garlands hung from the rafters, no music echoing through the wooden beams, no joyful tears from family or friends. Just dry wind pushing through the gaps in the chapel's siding and a congregation too small to fill the pews. The few guests present weren't there to wish the couple well. They came to see a transaction unfold, curious to witness the union between Garrett Calloway, heir to a cattle empire, and Evelyn McCrae, the quiet woman from a fading name. Garrett stood stiff in a black coat, boots polished to shine, but eyes shadowed by the weight of the day. The man who could command a herd with a look now stood still, as stone, not for love, but for legacy. His father Silas wasn't seated with pride, but with expectation, a man watching his plans take shape, like fencing laid across land newly claimed. Then Evelyn entered. She didn't float down the aisle or smile with hope. She walked with purpose, her veil catching the morning light like a thin mist. Her dress was modest dove, gray buttoned high, no lace, no satin, no sentiment. It was clear she wasn't here for romance. She was here because she had to be. The preacher's voice echoed off the old wood. "Do you, Garrett Calloway, take this woman?" Garrett's "I do" was low, restrained, a whisper of duty. Evelyn's reply was just as calm, her voice even, but without tenderness. When Garrett lifted the veil, he found not a frightened bride or a hopeful partner, but a woman whose gaze met his without flinching. There was no fear in her eyes, but neither was there warmth. She was there for survival, for respect, for a chance at reclaiming something lost. They didn't kiss. There were no cheers, just a nod from the preacher and the rustling of clothes as the sparse crowd stood unsure whether to clap or just leave. And so began a marriage, not of passion, but of practicality, two strangers bound not by affection, but by shared necessity. A ceremony not of hearts, but of hands signing unseen contracts in a chapel as bare as the promises made inside it. And yet beneath that quiet, beneath the dust and duty, something unspoken lingered, something waiting perhaps to be discovered later. Or not at all. Life at the Calloway Ranch settled into a rhythm, but not one of warmth or welcome. Garrett and Evelyn, though bound by law, lived like distant tenants in the same wide house. Their bedrooms stood at opposite ends of the hall. Doors always closed, voices rarely exchanged. In a house built with legacy and pride, the silence between them hung heavier than any storm cloud over the Colorado sky. Garrett, a man who'd spent his years rounding cattle and upholding his father's unspoken code, now found himself unsure of his footing. He wasn't cruel, just guarded, staring too long at his coffee, offering half-spoken greetings at breakfast, never quite knowing what to say to the woman who'd become his wife. Evelyn, for her part, wasn't timid. She wasn't the fragile, ridge girl Garrett had half remembered from years ago. She moved through the house with quiet certainty, rising before dawn, her boots already laced by the time Garrett stumbled into the kitchen. She didn't ask permission, didn't seek approval. When she opened the ranch ledgers one morning, Garrett had blinked in surprise. "You're reading the books?" he asked. She didn't look up. "You left them out?" she replied, simply flipping a page. "I figured I'd learn how this place breathes before trying to change its lungs." That reply stuck with him. It wasn't just the cleverness of it, it was the calm confidence. She was no guest, no outsider. She was setting down roots even if he hadn't invited them. Day after day, they lived side by side, not together. Garrett found himself watching her from doorways, from fence posts, from across the yard. Not like a man watching a woman he loved, but like a man who wasn't sure what kind of woman she was at all. She didn't smile often, didn't complain, and yet her presence filled the house in ways he hadn't expected. She boiled herbs for teas he'd never heard of. She repaired a broken latch on the barn door without asking for help. She took the weight of solitude and carried it without flinching. Garrett was used to controlling things cattle ranch hands, even the timing of storms in his mind. But Evelyn couldn't be led, couldn't be predicted. And that unsettled him more than he cared to admit. They shared meals but not laughter, shared space but not stories. And yet in that quiet, something else began to take shape. Not affection, not yet, but recognition. The kind that comes when you realize the stranger across the table has survived storms of her own. And maybe, just maybe, she's not as different from you as you thought. At the Callaway Ranch, life fell into a routine, but not the kind that binds two people. Garrett and Evelyn, though husband and wife in name, lived more like respectful strangers than anything resembling a couple. The house was large, each floorboard echoing with history, but between them it always seemed too quiet. Evelyn moved through the space with the silent strength of someone who had learned not to depend on kindness. She never tiptoed, never hesitated, just went about her day with intention. By the time Garrett woke, she was already seated at the kitchen table with a hot mug of black coffee and the ranch's financial ledger open before her. He hadn't asked her to read it, hadn't expected she'd even care to. But there she was, scanning rows of numbers like they held the key to something more than cattle counts and monthly expenses. "You're reading the books," he'd said once, blinking in mild surprise. Evelyn didn't look up. "You left them out," she replied. "I figured if I'm going to live here, I should understand what I'm living in." There was no flirtation in her voice, no pretense, just clarity. Garrett didn't know how to respond to a woman like that. His world had been shaped by hard work, long rides, and his father's expectations. Emotion in his family was something you fed to the dogs. But Evelyn, she wasn't cold. She was collected. She didn't try to earn his approval. She didn't fill the silence with small talk. She simply existed steady as the land itself. He noticed things, though, the way she lined her boots at the door, polished and precise. The herbs she hung to dry in the pantry, giving the house a scent of cedar and mint. The photograph of her father always kept by her bedside, its frame scratched but well-loved. These were not the habits of a woman passing through. They were the rituals of someone reclaiming a life on her own terms. Garrett felt conflicted. A part of him resented the arrangement, the way he'd been pushed into this union for the sake of land and legacy. But another part, quieter and harder to admit, found himself drawn to her resolve. Evelyn didn't ask for space, she took it. Not with arrogance, but with earned confidence. And he didn't know whether to step toward her or keep his distance. So they lived under one roof across two rooms, exchanging few words but sharing every dawn and dusk. A ranch can be a lonely place even with company. But sometimes in that stillness, something else stirs. Not quite love, not yet, but the faint recognition that maybe the stranger across the room might be holding the same kind of silence as you. It was the kind of wind that whispered warnings, dry, restless, and too fast for comfort. Garrett had been out near the south fence line when the scent hit him, sharp, acrid, urgent. Smoke. Not from the chimney, not from a campfire, this was wildfire smoke. Panic rose fast and hard in his chest. He spun his horse around and galloped toward the barn, dust trailing like a comet behind him. The ranch was chaos, hands shouting, horses, rearing buckets flying in every direction. And right in the thick of it stood Evelyn, sleeves rolled up, skirts tied at her knees, hauling two heavy pails of water, like she'd been raised fighting fire instead of hiding from it. Garrett nearly fell off his saddle in shock. "What the hell are you doing?" he yelled over the roar of flames and shouting men. She didn't flinch. Helping, she snapped back as if the answer should have been obvious. Her hair clung to her face, streaked with sweat and ash, but her grip on the buckets was steady. She moved with the determination of someone who didn't wait for permission to matter. Garrett jumped in beside her, grabbing his own pail, his boots sloshing through blackened mud. They worked side by side, no time for pleasantries, no room for pride. The blaze spared the barn thanks to their quick action and a lucky change in wind. When it was over, they stood shoulder to shoulder, their clothes-soaked skin smudged with soot, breathing hard beneath a sky still tinged gray. Garrett turned to her, eyes wide, voice rough. "You ever fought a fire before?" "No," she said, not looking at him. "But I've held back worse." That line, simple, honest, hit him harder than any ember could have. He saw her, then really saw her. Not as a burden, not as a deal struck in silence, but as a woman forged by survival. She wasn't meek. She wasn't frail. She was strength in quiet form, grit wrapped in grace. Later that night, when the fire was just memory and the porch creaked beneath tired feet, Garrett thought back to the look in her eyes. Not defiant, not proud, just sure. She hadn't asked for praise. She hadn't needed it. But something had changed. In the fire's aftermath, something fragile had ignited, not a flame exactly, but a spark. And Garrett, who had spent most of his life believing in duty, more than feeling, found himself wondering not just who she was, but who he might become if he stood beside her. The morning after the fire smelled of wet ash and coffee. The barn still stood singed but sturdy, and the air around the Callaway Ranch was quieter than usual, like the land itself was catching its breath. Garrett woke early, half expecting the house to be silent, but found Evelyn already at the kitchen table, dressed plainly, hair pulled back, a cup of strong, black coffee steaming by her side. In front of her lay the ranch's leather-bound ledger, open marked pages creased under her fingertips. Garrett blinked in surprise. "You're reading the books?" he asked, his voice still gravelly from sleep. "You left them out," she replied evenly, not looking up. "Figured I'd learn how this place breathes before trying to change its lungs." Her tone wasn't arrogant, it was practical, measured. Garrett pulled out a chair and sat across from her, the faint smell of soot still clinging to his shirt. There was something about the way she turned each page, calm, methodical, like someone who'd spent a lifetime watching men run things into the ground and decided she'd do it better. For the first time since they'd met at the chapel, Garrett didn't feel the need to speak. He just watched. Watched how her brow furrowed when she saw something that didn't add up. Watched how she underlined figures with the edge of her thumbnail, how she made quiet notes on a slip of paper pulled from her coat. Evelyn wasn't just surviving here. She was stepping into a role no one expected her to play, least of all him. He'd married her for her land on his father's orders, but he was beginning to realize she brought something else into this house, something steadier than beauty, more powerful than obedience. She brought intention. Garrett had always assumed strength wore spurs and shouted orders across cattle fields. But Evelyn's strength was quieter. It showed up at dawn with the coffee already brewed and the books already open. It didn't demand applause, only space to do what needed doing. As she flipped another page, Garrett cleared his throat, unsure why he suddenly felt like the one being measured. "You always talk like that?" he asked, half smiling. She finally looked up, expression unreadable. "Only when people assume I'm not thinking." That struck something deep in him, an old place buried under years of silence and duty. For a man raised on the hard edge of legacy, Garrett suddenly found himself drawn to this woman not out of obligation, but respect. And maybe the beginning of admiration. In that dusty morning light with numbers on paper and calloused hands curled around coffee cups, something shifted between them, not loudly, not dramatically, but deeply. Garrett began to see her not just as Evelyn McCrae, the girl from the ridge, but as the woman who might just know this ranch and him better than he ever dared to hope. The summer fair in Hollow Creek was more than just pies and pony rides. For folks in these parts, it was the place where reputations got stitched tighter or unraveled altogether. You didn't show up to the fair without knowing eyes would be watching, weighing your every glance and gesture like cattle at market. That's what made Evelyn's appearance all the more stirring. She hadn't been seen at a public gathering since the wedding, and before that it had been years since anyone could recall the McCrae girl outside her ridgeline homestead. But there she was now, walking steady beside Garrett Calloway, wrapped in a plain blue dress, her hair neatly pinned, face calm as a Sunday morning. No flashy jewels, no polished smile, just poise, the kind that didn't ask permission, the kind passed down from women who weathered droughts and still boiled coffee with grace. As they made their way through the fairgrounds, whispers followed like dust trails. "Ain't that the McCrae girl?" someone murmured. "Didn't think she had it in her." Others nodded, some in surprise, others in silent respect. Garrett didn't speak much, but his shoulders sat a little straighter, his eyes never straying too far from Evelyn's silhouette. At the pie table, where sugar crusts, cooled in the heat and competition, was as thick as molasses, Evelyn picked up a cherry pie entry and read the tiny handwriting on the label, lips gently pressed together. Two women sidled up beside her, the sort who spoke soft and judged sharp. That her thought she'd be plainer, one whispered. Evelyn didn't flinch. She turned slow and measured. "My father used to say, talk less and let your work answer louder." It wasn't a rebuke, it was a statement. Honest, unapologetic. The women blinked, caught off guard. One chuckled nervously. "Would you like a slice?" Evelyn paused, then nodded. "Only if you're sharing it honestly." That earned a small laugh. Not forced real, just enough to melt a little frost. That moment, so simple and subtle, cracked open something more profound than applause ever could. Garrett watched it happen, the shift. She hadn't demanded respect, she'd carried herself like she already had it. And people responded, not with cheers, but with lowered shoulders, open hands. Later, walking beside her through the fair's dirt paths and wooden stalls, Garrett murmured, "They expected someone smaller." Evelyn glanced sideways, her mouth just curved enough to suggest a smile. They weren't the only ones. He smiled, then real and wide, and reached out, not to guide her, not to protect, but simply to walk in step. In that one afternoon, Garrett saw what kind of woman he had married. Not a savior, not a shadow, but a storm in still water. And that kind of quiet strength didn't just command a town, it could teach a man who he really was.